Everybody, it's Empress. So today's topic is all about breaking barriers in the spiritual community and how mental mechanisms fuel perfectionism and block authentic growth. Now, before we get into the topic of discussion, I do want to give a quick disclaimer. The content in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. So always seek the guidance of a licensed therapist, counselor, or other qualified mental health providers with any questions you may have regarding your own mental health. The discussion on defense mechanisms, self awareness, and shadow work is based on general knowledge and may not apply to everyone's unique situation. So please note that some topics discussed may be considered controversial or potentially triggering for certain individuals. This is not intended to cause harm, but to bring awareness and encourage personal growth. So viewer discretion is advised, and any actions you take based on the information provided are solely at your own risk. With that being said, let's go ahead and get into the topic of discussion. In the spiritual community, there is often an unspoken pressure to appear enlightened, constantly positive, and flawlessly aligned with a higher purpose. While many may believe that these behaviors foster personal growth, they can actually hinder it. And by promoting hyper perfectionism and toxic positivity, these tendencies block true self awareness and inhibit the spiritual journey. At the heart of this struggle are mental mechanisms, unconscious defense strategies that were once viewed as essential for avoiding failure and preserving self respect. However, in the context of mental health and spiritual development, these mechanisms often do more harm than good. Mental mechanisms, also known as defense mechanisms, play a significant role in how we navigate both life and our spiritual journeys. In many cases, these mechanisms act as barriers, leading to hyperperfectionism and toxic positivity within the spiritual community. What was once thought to be a way of protecting ourselves from failure or maintaining our self respect is now seen as something that hinders our growth and mental health. These behaviors, when unchecked, interfere with awareness and stop us from evolving spiritually. So, first, let's discuss understanding mental mechanisms in the spiritual community. So, mental mechanisms, often referred to as defense mechanisms, are unconscious processes our mind uses to protect us from uncomfortable emotions and experiences. These mechanisms can sometimes be helpful in short term situations, but when they become habitual, they can interfere with our ability to grow and heal. In the spiritual community, we often see these defense mechanisms playing out in ways that lead to hyper-perfectionism and toxic positivity. Where these behaviors were once thought to be tools for avoiding failure or maintaining self respect, they actually prevent us from reaching true self awareness. This lack of awareness can become a barrier to authentic spiritual growth and mental health. Spiritual communities, which often focus on ideals like peace, positivity, and enlightenment, can unintentionally encourage the use of these defense mechanisms. For example, toxic positivity, the belief that we must always be positive and never express negative emotions, can stem from a fear of being judged as less spiritual. Hyperperfectionism arises when people believe they must always act in alignment with spiritual ideas, leaving no room for mistakes, setbacks, or personal challenges. These pressures create an environment where defense mechanisms can thrive. So now, let's talk about the most common defense mechanisms and how they manifest in spiritual communities. First up is rationalization. Rationalization occurs when we make excuses for our actions or thoughts to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. In the spiritual community, this might sound like it's just not aligned with my energy right now, when the real reason may be fear, self doubt, or avoidance. Rationalization stops us from taking accountability for our spiritual growth by creating false justifications for inaction. Next is compensation. Compensation involves covering up perceived weaknesses in one area by excelling in another. For example, someone who feels insecure about their personal relationships might throw themselves into their spiritual practice to appear more enlightened or put together in the eyes of the community. This mechanism masks underlying issues rather than resolving them. Next is displacement. Displacement happens when we redirect our emotions, especially anger or frustration, towards a safer target instead of addressing the actual source of our distress. In spiritual spaces, someone might displace their frustration with personal life circumstances onto their spiritual practice, blaming their lack of progress on things like low vibes or blaming others in the community. Now let's talk about projection. Projection involves attributing our own unwanted feelings or traits to others. This can be seen when someone accuses another of being judgmental, while in reality, they are struggling with their own judgments. In spiritual communities, projection can lead to unnecessary conflict or a distorted view of reality, blocking deeper self awareness. Next, let's talk about repression. Repression is the unconscious act of pushing painful or uncomfortable emotions into the background. A common example in spiritual circles is the insistence on remaining in high vibrations while suppressing any negative emotions. People repress feelings of anger, sadness, or frustration, labeling them as unspiritual, which ultimately stunts emotional healing. And it doesn't just stop there. Here are a few more defense mechanisms that could be blocking your spiritual growth. Conversion reaction. Conversion reaction occurs when emotional distress is converted into physical symptoms. For example, someone might develop spiritual ailments that they believe are caused by absorbing negative energy, where in reality, their body is reacting to unresolved emotional stress. This mechanism can distract from addressing the real emotional issues that need healing. Next is regression. So, regression is when we revert back to a childlike behaviors or earlier stages of emotional development when faced with stress or challenge. So, spiritually, regression might show up when people avoid taking responsibility for their actions by adopting a passive or helpless attitude, waiting for the universe or a spiritual guide to resolve their issues instead of just addressing them head on. Next is identification. Identification is the tendency to imitate or adopt the beliefs, behaviors, and traits of someone we admire or respect. In spiritual communities, this can manifest when followers mimic the actions or words of a spiritual leader rather than finding their own voice or approach to spiritual growth. While it can be useful to learn from others, this mechanism often limits personal authenticity and individual growth. Then you have suppression. Suppression is a conscious act of choosing to avoid certain thoughts or emotions. Unlike repression, which is unconscious, suppression happens when someone actively avoids dealing with uncomfortable feelings by diving deeply into spiritual practices. For example, someone might meditate or practice yoga as a way to distract themselves from stress at work or in relationships rather than addressing the root cause of their distress. Next is sublimation. Sublimation involves redirecting negative emotions or impulses into socially acceptable outlets. While this mechanism can have positive outcomes, such as channeling anger into activism or creativity, it can also prevent individuals from addressing the deeper, unresolved emotions. In spiritual circles, sublimation might look like constantly striving for spiritual progress to avoid confronting deeper personal wounds. Next is reaction formation. Reaction formation occurs when someone acts in a way that is opposite of how they truly feel. For instance, someone might present as overly positive and optimistic even when they're feeling deeply hurt or frustrated. In spiritual spaces, this mechanism fuels the culture of toxic positivity, where people suppress negative emotions out of fear that they will appear less spiritual. Now, before I continue, I do want to take a quick pause to clarify something very important. This discussion is in no way meant to bash or criticize anyone. The behaviors we're talking about are extremely common, and we all may have engaged in them at some point, including myself. Okay, these defense mechanisms are learned behaviors, often shaped by our environments and life experiences. The purpose of bringing this to light is to raise awareness, not to judge. By understanding these patterns, we can start to recognize them in ourselves and make conscious choices to develop healthier behavioral patterns. Growth comes from self awareness, and this conversation is meant to help us all on that journey. So, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get into some more examples of each defense mechanism and how they commonly show up in the spiritual community. So, you may have recognized yourself doing some of these things or other people doing these things. But again, the purpose of this is just to bring awareness to our actions and these situations. So, here's how rationalization might show up. One example is a spiritual practitioner might avoid confronting their deep seated fear of failure by saying, "It's not in alignment with the universe right now," instead of acknowledging that they are just afraid to take risks or make mistakes. And how does this tend to play out? This excuse justifies inaction or avoidance. People often convince themselves that they are following a higher calling when in reality, they're just afraid of rejection or failure. Now, let's talk about compensation and how this might play out. So, one example is someone who feels insecure about their knowledge in one spiritual area, like meditation, might overcompensate by diving deep into other practices such as astrology or healing crystals, presenting themselves as an expert in those fields. And again, how does this play out? Instead of addressing the area they feel weak in, they distract themselves by excelling in something else, avoiding personal growth in the areas where they feel vulnerable. For compensation, it's important to note that this has nothing to do with people who are genuinely multifaceted or passionate about multiple aspects of spirituality. There's absolutely nothing wrong with having varied interests or skills. The issue lies in using one area to avoid addressing another. Compensation becomes a problem when someone uses one practice to distract themselves from facing insecurities or weaknesses in other areas of their life or spiritual journey. And we tend to see this a lot with people who just avoid shadow work and then they go to astrology and they start to blame their feelings or behaviors on their astrological placements. So, in reality, when it comes to compensation, it's more about avoidance, not genuine passion. So, please do not get that confused. Next, we're going to talk about displacement. So, here's an example of that. A person frustrated with their personal relationships or financial situation might take out their anger on their spiritual practices, blaming negative energy or spiritual blockages for their problems. And how does this play out? This allows someone to vent their frustration without confronting the real issue, blaming their spiritual path or some external energy rather than just taking accountability for the situation. And no, I'm not saying that there's not people out there who don't do black magic or root work on people. The point is, this is why we tell you to do divination. Because doing divination lets you know if someone is actually out there doing work on you or if you're doing work on yourself. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Next is projection. So, one example is a person might accuse others in their spiritual community of being inauthentic or not truly spiritual, when in reality, they are struggling with their own feelings of inauthenticity or doubt in their practice. So, how does this one play out? By projecting their insecurities onto others, they avoid confronting their internal conflicts, often leading to unnecessary division and judgment within spiritual groups. And unfortunately, we see this a lot when it comes to the clash of religions and spiritual practices. You have a clash between voodoo, hoodoo, Wicca, Santeria, and Christianity. And I'm throwing Christianity in there because that is also a spiritual practice. And that's also where me personally, I see a lot of projection coming from. But that's neither here nor there. Let's go ahead and continue. Next, let's talk about repression. So, an example of this could be someone who might constantly say, love and light, and force a smile, all while they are deeply struggling with unresolved anger, grief, or fear. They push those emotions down because they believe it's unspiritual to feel negative emotions. And how does repression play out? Repression leads to unprocessed emotions, making it harder for individuals to heal. Over time, this can result in emotional burnout or breakdowns since the person has denied themselves the opportunity to process their feelings. Next, let's talk about conversion reaction. An example is a person who is feeling anxious or stressed. They might start to develop unexplained physical symptoms like headaches or fatigue and attribute them to absorbing too much negative energy from others, rather than recognizing that their mental state is affecting their body. And how does this play out? This can distract someone from addressing the real source of their stress or anxiety, as they believe their physical symptoms are purely spiritual, preventing them from seeking proper emotional or medical support. Now, I'm not saying that it's not possible to absorb negative energy from others because transference of energy is a real thing. But again, if you are avoiding going to the doctor and just saying that you're absorbing somebody's negative energy, that's a problem. You need to go get real medical and emotional support. You can't just say, I'm an empath. I'm an empath. Take your empathic ass to the doctor. Because there's plenty of ways you can quote unquote absorb negative energy. You can pick up negative energy from people, stress from your job, or even financial stress. All of these can contribute to those lower vibrational feelings. So if you are feeling burned out or anxious, address that and go get some help because ignoring the problem does not make it go away. Now let's get into regression. An example of regression could be a spiritual practitioner when faced with a personal challenge or failure, they may start behaving in a more childish or dependent way, perhaps looking for someone in the community to save them or provide all the answers rather than taking responsibility for their own spiritual growth. And how does this play out? This regression can cause individuals to place unrealistic expectations on their spiritual leaders or guides, treating them as parental figures who are responsible for their well being instead of empowering themselves. And unfortunately, we see this a lot when it comes to tarot readings. And one day I realized the reason why tarot readings are so popular is because I feel as tarot readers, we provide people with the reassurance that they didn't get from their parents growing up. And when it also comes to readings, a lot of us don't realize this, but we are creating safe spaces for people to express their emotions where they're not able to express them anywhere else. So it's easy for these people to really get latched onto you because that's the only place where they feel safe or empowered. And that's why it's so important as a spiritual leader, you have to continue to let your clients know that they are more than capable of making decisions for themselves. They don't have to go sit down for a reading every single day. At some point on your spiritual journey, you have to learn how to just trust your intuition and act accordingly. Next, let's talk about identification. One example is a follower might start mimicking the exact practices, phrases, or beliefs of a spiritual leader, adopting their habits without critical thought or personal reflection, believing this makes them more spiritual. And how does this play out? While learning from others is important, this behavior stifles individual spiritual development. The person is not exploring their own beliefs or practices, but is simply copying others, which may limit their personal growth. And a lot of people might say that imitation is the best form of flattery, but the real quote is imitation is the sincerest form of flattery that mediocrity can pay to greatness. So when you're out here copying people and not doing the work yourself, it comes out very diluted and you're putting yourself in a box instead of just trusting your own intuition and your own creativity. So in reality, it's not going to make you seem more spiritual by copying somebody else in the spiritual community. It's going to make you appear lost. Now let's talk about suppression. So one example of this could be someone who might deliberately avoid thinking about a painful event or emotional struggle, choosing instead to immerse themselves in spiritual practices like meditation or energy healing to push the discomfort out of their mind. And how does this play out? Though suppression is a conscious act, it prevents real healing. By focusing only on positive practices, they avoid addressing underlying issues that need to be confronted. Now, there is nothing wrong with practicing meditation or energy healing to help yourself de stress, but it is the problem when you're avoiding the real issue or you're avoiding to change the behaviors or situations, environments, or circumstances that is bringing that stress. It's like at some point, when does the healing journey come to an end? Okay, it's when those behaviors that you adopted that leads to these stressful circumstances come to an end. For example, if you have a bruise or a cut on your body or a burn, over time that bruise is going to heal up. You might be left with a scar, but as long as you don't sit there and keep picking at it, that wound is going to close up. Okay? So if you're on a healing journey and it's like this healing journey is never coming to an end, you have to ask yourself why. And it's because you never address the real problem. You cannot meditate your way out of poverty. You can meditate for 40 days and 40 nights, but until you fix your terrible spending habits and your limiting beliefs about money, you will forever be poor. Now let's talk about sublimation. So, one example of this is a person with feelings of anger or frustration may channel those emotions into intense spiritual practices, such as doing excessive rituals or overcommitting to community service as a way of avoiding dealing with the root cause of their emotions. So, how does sublimation play out? While sublimation can seem productive, the underlying emotions are not being directly addressed. Instead, they are transformed into spiritual actions, which may delay the resolution of personal conflicts. So, I feel a better example of this could be if you're experiencing relationship problems, instead of you going to your partner and asking them how they feel and why they feel that way, you decide to go pay somebody for a love spell in hopes that they just stop feeling the way that they feeling or acting the way that they acting. So imagine yourself spending $333 for a love ritual just to still end up single because you just haven't taken the time to work on your communication skills. And last, I'm going to give you guys an example of reaction formation. So, this could be a person who is secretly struggling with jealousy, and they might go out of their way to act overly loving and supportive towards the person that they envy. They hide their true feelings behind exaggerated acts of kindness. So, how does this one play out? This behavior creates internal conflict. While they may appear positive on the surface, their unresolved negative emotions remain unaddressed, leading to resentment or even a sense of inauthenticity in their spiritual journey. And this is why you have to use discernment, because there's people in the spiritual community who will come off extremely nice and extremely helpful, and they'll get very close to you, and you will notice that they're stealing your ideas or they're starting to copy things from you. And if you start to address that, that's when they start to lash out and they want to throw you under the bus and start a whole hate train. When in reality, these people never liked you. They may have admired the work that you were doing, but they didn't like that it was you that was doing it. And that's why they steal and that's why they copy. Because it should have been me. It should have been me. So when people come into your life and start love bombing you, be very, very aware. Okay. It's something up under that mask, and you might not like what you see up under the. All right. But let's go ahead and keep it on topic and get back to the discussion. So let's talk about how defense mechanisms inhibit spiritual growth. All of these mechanisms share one common trait: they block us from true self awareness. Spiritual growth requires us to face uncomfortable truths about ourselves. When defense mechanisms take over, we lose touch with our authentic feelings, leading to disconnection from ourselves and our spiritual journey. Awareness and emotional balance are crucial for spiritual growth. If we continue to let these defense mechanisms dictate our actions, we'll be stuck in cycles of avoidance and self deception. Spirituality is about finding alignment with our true selves, and that process requires us to face both the light and dark aspects of who we are, not just the love and light, but also the dark aspects as well. So let's talk about developing self awareness. So, self awareness is the first step in breaking free from the patterns of defense mechanisms. The more self aware we become, the more we can observe our thoughts and behaviors without judgment. Instead of letting defense mechanisms dictate our actions, we can choose to respond consciously. So, here are some practical ways to develop self awareness. One is journaling. Writing down your thoughts, emotions, and experiences can help you identify patterns and triggers that reveal which defense mechanisms are at play. Regular reflection allows you to step back and view your actions from a clearer perspective. Next is mindfulness and meditation. These practices encourage us to observe our thoughts and emotions without reacting to them. And I know a lot of people think that meditation is about quieting the mind, when in reality, meditation and mindfulness is just about observing your thoughts in the moment and why you're thinking that way in the moment. So, by staying present, we create space between our emotions and our responses, helping us avoid the automatic use of defense mechanisms. Next is accountability partners. Having someone in your life who can provide honest, non judgmental feedback can help you see the blind spots in your behavior. Accountability helps you stay grounded in reality rather than hiding behind defense mechanisms. At the end of the day, nobody wants to sit there and admit to themselves that, hey, I might actually be a bad person. Everybody thinks that they're a good person. And it's just because in society, if you're perceived to be a bad person, this could be very unsafe for you. Deep down, we all realize that bad people go to jail. Okay, so nobody wants to ever be perceived as a bad person. But you could also be a good person with bad behaviors or bad habits. At the end of the day, improving self awareness is essential for understanding the hidden motivations behind our behaviors. It helps us see where we're avoiding certain emotions and begin the process of accepting them. And this is where shadow work comes into play. Once we recognize the defense mechanisms we use, the next step is self acceptance. This can be achieved through a process called shadow work, which involves facing the parts of ourselves we typically avoid, deny, or hide. Shadow work helps us integrate all parts of our being rather than pushing them away. Shadow work allows us to see our flaws and vulnerabilities as part of the whole self rather than something to be rejected. This process fosters true self acceptance, which is the foundation of spiritual growth. Here are some ways to begin practicing shadow work. 1. Identify your triggers. Pay attention to the situations or people that trigger strong emotional reactions. These are often a reflection of unresolved issues within yourself. By understanding your triggers, you can start to uncover the deeper parts of yourself that need healing. 2. Sit with uncomfortable emotions. Instead of running from negative emotions like anger, sadness, or frustration, allow yourself to feel them fully. Sitting with feelings of discomfort helps you understand the root of these emotions rather than masking them with positivity. 3 is use prompts for a deeper reflection. Guided meditations, journaling prompts, or introspective exercises can help you explore the hidden parts of yourself. These tools can bring unconscious aspects of your personality into the light, allow for deeper healing. So let's go ahead and wrap things up and talk about moving toward authentic growth. True spiritual growth doesn't come from avoiding pain or striving for perfection. It comes from accepting every part of ourselves, the good, the bad, and the uncomfortable. Defense mechanisms may have served us in the past, but they no longer serve our higher purpose. By recognizing and dismantling these mechanisms, we open ourselves up to true self awareness, self acceptance, and spiritual growth. The journey isn't about being perfect or always maintaining a positive mindset. It's about embracing the wholeness of who we are and allowing that authentic self to guide us. Spirituality is a path of self discovery, and the more honest we are with ourselves, the more profound our growth will be. All right, Mr. Moguls, that's it for today's podcast. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, remember to like, share, or leave a comment. All right, you guys, I see you in the next one. Love you guys. Bye.